Well, good evening and welcome to Rasha Christi, South Africa, and welcome to our weekly interview with scholars from all over South Africa and scholars from all over the world on all kinds of interesting and controversial subjects. And this evening will be no different. But welcome to Rasha Christi. We are a student campus organization based at 5 universities in South Africa: Rhodes, Stellenbosch, UKZN, Northwest University, and the University of Pretoria. And our goal is to seek to serve the Christians on campus by equipping and training them to better understand the Christian faith and to deal with all of those criticisms or objections leveled against the Christian faith in whatever field, whatever issue is at hand. And so we are a ministry that is about that task. We believe the universities to be of vital importance to South Africa, but I think universities, it can be said, are important to any country because that's where the leadership are for the most part going to come from. So we hope to have a Christian voice in the university, and we encourage young Christians to visit our website. We have a website, rashachristi.co.za, on which you can get a number of resources and articles on all kinds of interesting topics, including the one which we're going to speak about this evening. I do also ask you to take a look at our YouTube channel. We have a growing library of interviews we've been doing over this pandemic year, and we're going to continue that program as we continue on as a ministry. So please do subscribe there if you can on our YouTube channel. And also please, since we are a student campus ministry, we often do not have money because our students are not working yet, but hopefully you might consider supporting us as well as we proceed to train and equip the next generation of Christian leaders here in South Africa and in the continent of Africa. So welcome to us this evening. We're very privileged this evening to have a guest speaker, Dr. Robert Osburn, who's coming to us from the United States. Dr. Osburn has his PhD from the University of Minnesota. He also has a THM from Dallas Theological Seminary and is a senior fellow at the Wilberforce Academy. Dr. Osburn has got extensive experience teaching students from all over the world in the Wilberforce Academy. And a big passion of his is his work that he's done on the issue of the effects of corruption in society at all different levels. And not shying away, he deals with this issue as we have corruption in our churches. So he is an expert in this area. We've actually had him visit us in South Africa a few years ago. And this is an important topic. I think it might be fair to say that in Africa, the subject of corruption might be, if not the top issue confronting just about every country in Africa, is problems with corruption. Corruption almost at every level through our society. And this evening we're going to speak to Dr. Osburn, and he's going to unpack the question of the effects of corruption in society and what should we do about it. Dr. Osburn, good evening and welcome to Rasha Christi, South Africa.
It's a pleasure to be here, Simon. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to interacting with your students and other listeners.
Fantastic. What Dr. Osburn's going to do for us this evening is he's going to do a lecture, which is going to be about 30 minutes or so. And then we're going to be asking some questions out of that, because I think he would like to pack in some information there for our listeners and really open you up to this critical subject of corruption, and particularly as Christians, how we should think about it and how we should not just cave into the cynicism. But we're also going to be taking some questions from our audience via YouTube, so do feel free to participate in that as well. Dr. Osburn, I'll hand it over to you now, and I think you can get your PowerPoint up and running.
Wonderful. Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm so glad to be with all of you today, and I'm thankful that you care enough to be willing to engage in this kind of conversation. I call this, in this particular presentation and in others that I've given, I call this the torrent that is the rushing, raging stream that tears up society, how corruption hurts us all, and what we can do about it. So I look forward to interacting with you. I hope you'll save your questions. I love to have challenging questions because If we're serious about this as Christians, we've got to dig in deep on this issue and go in where the weeds are high, because that's the only place where we're going to be able to bring a redemptive change, in my opinion. So let me move ahead here now to my next slide. This picture epitomizes the exact reason that I am considered one of the experts in the area of corruption. And it was all because 35 years ago, when I came to the University of Minnesota with my wife, who is pictured next to me here as she's kneeling, and our young sons at the time, when I came here, very quickly I discovered that as I interacted with international students from around the world, the issue that would come up over and over and over again, relentlessly, when I asked them what was hard about life back home, inevitably the topic of corruption was right at the very top of their list. And so I realized that here was an issue that not at that point, very few Christians were even talking about. And we had almost no, to my knowledge at that time, there may have not been any more than one or two tools anywhere in the globe that were actually addressing this topic from a Christian perspective. And so this worked inside of me. And finally, a number of years ago, I decided to make this one of the strategic scholarly foci for my work, my life. And I have since written a book called Taming the Beast. Well, let's talk about why this is a huge issue. Many of you are there in South Africa. And in the South African context, I know that this is probably number one in your media. It's every day, whether it's the issues of what to do with your former president, Jacob Zuma, or what to do with other actors who are working feverishly to rob the public purse in order to expand their private purses. So everywhere I go around the world, though, it's the daily encounters with government officials that is one of the big driving issues behind this. And then what that extends to inevitably is the reality of the broken down infrastructure that you can find in so many countries around the world. I remember going to India, Northeast India, 11 years ago, and the horrible roads that they have there. And I was reminded by my mentee there that it was the 10% government minister who was responsible for it. Actually, 10% is the minimum that most government officials expect to skim off of any kind of contract that they make with the private sector. And in fact, many of those skim-offs amount to closer to 30%. So the phenomenon of state capture, which is very real for you in South Africa, the question that you South Africans are asking yourself is the Public Protector's Office a sham? We're going to be getting to that later when I talk about the phenomenon of the fox guarding the hen house. I hope that idea, that image, is one that some of you may recognize, but it may be a unique metaphor that's unique to America. But I think you'll quickly understand what I'm talking about. But very sadly, as I discovered a few years ago when I was speaking in Cameroon at a theological seminary there about corruption, the very first question that was raised, and it was raised by a professor at the seminary, was the question, why do we have so much corruption in our churches? And tragically, we would have to say that throughout a great deal of Africa today, at least half, or probably a majority, I would guess a majority based on what I know right now, a majority of churches are probably corrupt in one way or the other. I've spoken to groups of pastors in Congo, DRC, about corruption, and they don't disagree with me at all when I say that this is a massive issue and that they are partly responsible for it. But one of the questions I'm asking is, what is the role of the prosperity gospel? And perhaps in our conversation, we can get into that. But finally, what is the most disturbing to me is the cynicism that I heard from a Malawian economist who is here actually in Minnesota right now working for a conservative think tank. And she said, Bob, it is so everywhere in our lives that we grow up assuming that there is nothing that we can do about it. There's a full level of apathy that just overwhelms people's lives. So when we talk about corruption, we're talking about what I call the social and personal decay that results when people seek their private gain at public expense. My definition is only a little different from others in that I emphasize the phenomenon of decay, and I'll tell you why in just a few minutes. But I first want to introduce you to the basic model that I work with when I teach about corruption. And that is that I argue that there are four streams that work together to create the mighty torrent that tears up and destroys our societies. There's the problem of sin. There's the problem of the pre-modern lives that many of us grew up with or near in our societies. There's the problem of the modern state. And then last of all, there's the problem of postmodern suspicion that is so prevalent in our advanced universities and academic institutions. So it's a torrent that tears up society. And it does the kind of devastation that I think, at least metaphorically, it matches to some degree the kind of devastation that we see after major cyclones and hurricanes. But this first stream, the issue of primordial sin. This is fundamental to a Christian understanding of the human being. While we are created in the image of God, and that image is still very much in place in each of us, that image has been distorted and diminished, and in many ways it's been damaged by the reality of sin, going back to all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. But what shocks people is the fact that both the Hebrew and Greek words used in the Old and New Testaments that are translated corrupt, that are used for the concept of corruption, they inevitably involve the idea of destruction due to rotting and spoilage. There's about, give or take, 100 passages that use this kind of language, but the words that are used always talk about the way that sin rots, it spoils lives, it corrupts one's life. The very first time you see the word corrupt used in the English Bible is in reference to Noah's era. So in Genesis chapter 6, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Well, what's so interesting about that is that a few verses later, God says, I'm going to bring the floodwaters on the earth. I'm going to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has life, the breath of life in it. What's so fascinating is that the very Hebrew word used in verse 17, when God says, I will destroy life, is exactly the same Hebrew word to describe the corruption of human beings back earlier in that chapter. So it's as if God is saying, I'm going to give you the very thing that you've brought on the earth. You've destroyed life. You are destroying life. You've destroyed society, and now I'm going to have to destroy you. But there's a second stream that is very real when we understand how corruption becomes the torrent that destroys our societies, and that's the reality of pre-modern shamanism. I'm not unaware, certainly, that you live in a continent known for the high degree of participation in shamanism or in some kind of witchcraft. As you know, that is a major issue in your part of the world. And so it's a transactional culture that is developed within shamanism, where the objective is to pay the shaman or the witch doctor so that person then will contact the spirits and give you blessing and perhaps cast suffering on your neighbor who you're jealous of. And so you do that in order to get what you want out of this. But what we discover is that people transfer that transactional process that's central to the shamanistic or to shamanism or to witchcraft. They transfer that to the way that they interact with government officials. So government officials are like shamans or witch doctors. You pay them to give you what you want. A number of scholars have pointed this out, and I am highly persuaded that that's one of the very real issues that's working there. Now, let me try to show you empirically the evidence that suggests that this is exactly what's happening. The Corruption Perceptions Index has been developed by Transparency International. It's regarded as the gold standard for understanding the levels of corruption around the world. So there's a 100-point scale that the index uses, 100 being perfectly non-corrupt, and of course 0 means absolutely and totally corrupt. What we find is that 61, or 1/3 of the 180 nations that are tested every year, 1/3 of them score at 33 or below. That means they're highly corrupt nations. So the least corrupt region of the world, interestingly enough, is Europe. The EU has an average score of 66. But the most corrupt region, as you can see right there, is Sub-Saharan Africa, where the average score is 32. And I suggest that is highly correlated with the reality, the highly transactional culture of shamanism. Interestingly, in my final bullet here, you'll notice that 8 out of 10 of the least corrupt countries around the world, that is those who score 80 and above, are historically Protestant. The key word is historically Protestant. The only other 2 that don't fit that top 10, one is Singapore, and we have a guest here from Singapore right now, and that's because the founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, was someone who had studied in England. He had recognized the significance and the power of having a non-corrupt culture. And so when he founded Singapore, he immediately instituted a fierce and firm rule that none of his officials were to be corrupt. He was very successful in keeping Singapore one of the least corrupt nations of the world. The other one is Luxembourg, which is largely a small Catholic country in Europe. Here's another way of visualizing this. So if you look at the CPI index from 2017, once again, you'll notice that the countries with the yellow shade are all, with the exception of Japan, and hidden in there, Singapore, which you can't see, are virtually all countries that have a historic Protestant heritage. And there is a very real reason for that. But I want to get in now to the third stream, and that is the modern state. This is the one that raises so many questions for people. It makes enormous promises about producing human flourishing, but it turns out that it actually fails. It does it to some degree, but it fails to control corruption. So what happened was, during the Enlightenment, the policymaker and the scientist began to replace the pastor and the shaman as the officials who could truly fashion the ideal society. Education replaced the church, and then Max Weber, the great German sociologist, said that the complex society, the Gesellschaft, replaces the Gemeinschaft, that is the local community. And they believe that impersonal rules, bureaucracy, and technology would bring human flourishing and fairness and success. So you have all these phenomena like border controls, the judiciary, political decision-making, and so forth. But in reality, what we find is that these institutions of the modern state actually open up tremendous space for people who want to enrich themselves at public expense. And we're finding more and more ways that people are doing this. I have only recently begun to theorize that many of the countries around the world that depend on foreign remittance from countries like USA, that is, their family members come to USA, they get good paying jobs, then they send money back home, for example, to countries and their families back in Africa, that every time that money is transferred back to Africa, the state officials find ways to drain off some of that through very clever means. But on top of that, the foreign remittance, when it's used in the markets, then some of that then inadvertently or advertently is drained off to enrich public officials. So there are no community controls for public officials in the modern state, whereas you had those in the pre-modern reality. So while the pre-modern world is shamanistic and it's very transactional, there are community controls, and that to some degree or another actually limits corruption. You don't have that with the modern state. The modern individual is a free ranger who can do almost whatever he or she wants to do. So what we're finding increasingly is that we cannot get the state to be an effective controller of corruption. They try. There are public protectors' offices, there are anti-corruption commissions, but in reality, public officials are finding ways to steal. But here's another part of this. I mentioned this earlier, the fox who guards the hen house. So in essence, you have policemen or police officials who are hired by the state. You have judges who are hired by the state. You have lawmakers that is parliamentarians whose salary is paid by the state. These people know each other. Are they not going to, in fact, find ways to protect each other from having to pay the price of their corruption? And so, in essence, rather than the fox truly protecting the larger community of citizens in South Africa, for example, the fox that is the modern state is actually stealing. And this is happening throughout the world to one degree or another. So we are having to deal with this problem, and it's a tremendous problem that people and theorists still don't have real answers to. Finally, we want to talk about postmodern suspicion. And because time is racing on here, and I want to be able to give enough time for your questions and for interaction with Simon, let me just summarize this by saying that for those of you who are deeply aware of postmodern thought, which has become in the last 30 years supreme in the humanities and social sciences, postmodern thought essentially says that what's going on in the world is that those people who claim to be speaking in favor of truth, and people like Bob Osburn who are speaking in favor of an anti-corrupt mindset, are actually people who are using their power to get the rest of the world and the rest of society under their thumb. So the very suspicious postmodernist would look at me actually as a very cleverly disguised white male who is trying to actually enrich himself while actually teaching against such things. But what this does, as I hope you already recognize, is that this comes around to a complete redefinition of truth, if not an utter attack on the notion of truth. So what postmodernists have come around to actually do, and they're doing it all the time in our institutions, not only here in America, not only in Europe, but it's coming in a big way to South Africa and other universities around the world, is they're undermining truth. And my argument is that if we give up truth, we give up one of the primary bases for taming this beast called corruption. One of the ways that they talk about this, by the way, is this idea of the colonizers and the colonized. And so, again, because of my ancestry in Europe, I'm often seen as the colonizer, and you're very familiar with that reality, and it's how it's played out through apartheid in South Africa. So corruption, as I say here, is among other things a betrayal of truth, shadowed by shame, masked by hidden handshakes, and secret suitcases full of money. So I'm suggesting that these four streams have created a torrent that is tearing up our societies. But now for the good news, and we're going to have to race through this, but we can take more time during the Q&A. Deuteronomy 10:17 says in a profound way, "For the Lord your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, the great and the mighty, the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribes." I wish we had time to read this wonderful quote by Professor Noonan as he talks about the difference between bribes and a gift. And remember, Christianity is not built on transactionalism like shamanism. It's built on a gift. God gives his son. And that concept of the gift creates the entire Christian vision for confronting corruption and building societies of transparency and integrity. But you might be thinking that I'm like Don Quixote. I'm dreaming the impossible dream. There are many people in your cotton who've given up and said there's nothing we can do about it. I suggest that taming the culture of corruption obviously involves holding our leaders accountable. We have to do that. And you're trying very hard. And many of your fellow citizens are there in South Africa. But I suggest also that we have to replace transactional cultures with cultures of grace. And I truly question whether many of our churches truly understand this point. When I see the level of corruption in so many of the churches around the world, especially, I'm sorry to say, in sub-Saharan Africa, I wonder whether they really have replaced the transactional culture of shamanism with the truly Christian cultures of grace, where you give to your neighbor in order to ensure that they thrive. That becomes your motivational center. And when you do so, you're building trust in the society. And when you're building trust, fair and flourishing markets, instead of patronage, become the norm. You see, trust is always the key here, but trust will never emerge unless service and love, this culture of grace, dominates your society. Thirdly, I'm convinced, and I say this all the time when I'm in Africa or elsewhere in the world, that our churches have to take the leadership. Singapore is a small enough city-state that one strong man was able to rule with great might and effectiveness and wipe out almost all evidence of corruption. But in the rest of the world, it's going to depend on churches. In most of sub-Saharan Africa, as you may know, and this is abundantly true in places like DRC Congo, churches are the most respected institutions, even though they are largely corrupt. Instead of solving the cultural problem of corruption, they are continuing to fuel it. And there's no surprise that corruption is not leaving the state there. If our churches took the leadership on this issue, I believe we would see a transformation. And I want to say to you that Ephesians 3:10, in my view, gives us an exact mandate to do so. For it says there, as Paul wrote, God's intent was that now through the church, listen to these words, the multifaceted or manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and the authorities in the heavenly realms. And if you will consider with me the idea that the rulers and the authorities was code. It was code for massive political power. Paul was in a Roman prison, a prison that was ruled by Caesar. He could not say that the church would teach Caesar how to behave. So he had to say, it will be made known to the rulers and the authorities in heavenly realms, high up realms, a metaphor for massive political power. The churches are the secret to changing this horror. Well, I'm going to conclude now with my 5-part strategy. I'm going to quickly go over this and then we'll end here. I believe there are 5 things that need to be done in any effective Christian social change effort. 5 things have to take place, and I'm applying this now to the challenge of corruption. First of all, I've already said, churches need to begin discipling their nations by modeling transparency and integrity. We must start with churches. If our pastors are not willing to get on with this task, I truly doubt that the strategy will be effective. So I challenge you to begin challenging pastors across South Africa and around the world. Number 2, pastors need to begin prioritizing the discipleship of their members, discipling them for integrity. Why is integrity not one of the top 3 or 4 issues that we talk about in discipleship? If the lack of integrity is the norm in society, and if truth is at the very core of a Christian vision of life, we ought to prioritize discipling people for integrity. Number 3, we must as Christians form groups and educational and curricular groups that will be developing anti-corruption curricula to be used in our churches. We should have an anti-corruption Sunday, by the way, every year in every church. We should have church education materials for the small children all the way to adults. And then we should eventually get that curricula worked into our schools one way or the other. Fourthly, we need to have a high-performing network that takes responsibility to create a transformative movement. There in South Africa, in Cape Town, you have the headquarters for Unashamedly Ethical, founded by Graham Power, one of the leading business people in all of South Africa. I can envision a high-performing network that they pull together from across South Africa that says, we are going to take responsibility to create a transformative movement that begins to push out the culture of corruption. This is a culture. It's a cultural problem at its heart. Last of all, you need someone who's willing to be the public champion for transparency and anti-corruption. Somebody who's effective and in the public eye on a regular basis and saying, we stand against this. We stand for integrity and transparency. Thank you so much. Here's my email address. If you'd like to be in contact with me, I'll be happy to interact with you. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Osburn, for that lecture. I know that there's probably a lot more that you could have packed into all of that in terms of the content. I know that's the case with the book that you've written and everything. And I've personally on the subject began to take more of an interest in kind of taking a deeper look into the nature of corruption, particularly as it's related to certain other ideas. So your section there where you're talking about the relationship between things like truth and corruption and how essential that is. And of course, it's all the more difficult if you're living in a postmodern age in which people don't believe there's any truth. Then at the same time are shouting, we want to get rid of corruption. You want to try and ask, well, okay, so exactly how can those two things square up? So that's an interesting thing. And of course, here in Africa, we might say, well, but postmodernism as a philosophy is really kind of a European invention. But certainly it's becoming an issue here.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about this issue, because I want to give you the kind of description of where I think South Africans are. The scale of corruption is such that it's everywhere. Even in my own hometown, you can just go outside. The local municipality is bankrupt, and there's just so many issues, amongst other things here. And what ends up happening is when there's no rule of law, when there's all the government officials and of course all of the companies all have these wonderful statements. I mean, and it's not just South Africa. If you go and look at Lehman Brothers a few years ago, they probably had we are this and we're all about integrity, and a lot of that's a very popular thing now with the corporate
Absolutely.
world.
Yeah.
Here in South Africa, we had our own version. We had Steinhoff, this big company. It's sponsoring everybody. It's all over the place. But there's issues. There's issues there, and it's very difficult and very discouraging, because it just kind of seems like people are saying, well, we're all anti-corruption, but then nothing happens because there's nobody being held accountable, and more importantly, in South Africa, seems like there's few people that are being prosecuted. I mean, how do you just stave off just collapsing into cynicism? Because then what happens with a lot of South Africans is they just kind of give up, or they just say, well, if you can't beat them, join them, and then it becomes a spiral, and it just kind of tightens in on yourself. I mean, what would you say to people to try and spare them from becoming cynical about this whole thing? Because it's very, very, very dispiriting, if I could use that word. It seems kind of pointless. When you speak out against it, everybody just thinks you're naive. They kind of laugh at you.
You're Don Quixote, as I said, the man of La Mancha, who's a thin man riding a thin, emaciated horse, and he's on a crusade that he'll certainly lose. So why bother?
Yeah.
This is the reality, and I hear it from people around the world. You should hear Nigerians talk about what's going on in Nigeria. This is just prevalent in an incredible way. For example, in Nigeria, as you know, but throughout most of Africa and really throughout much of the world. I think let's be frank with each other that cynicism is going to be our default mode in a corrupt world. I can't imagine that as the Lord looked at the world as it was in Noah's time, that the people themselves didn't already talk among themselves, that there's nothing you can do, that we're all corrupt, and we know it, and there's nothing. So we might as well get all we can get today, because that's the only way you get ahead. So the condemnation that God offered was one that they had given to themselves, I believe, long ahead of time. So what do? This is why I would argue that we've got to come back to our churches, and we've got to begin challenging our pastors and our church leaders and our Christian leaders in our society, that we have got to take and develop communities of hope. When I think about the American civil rights movement led by the great Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s, that was a very successful movement. What's happening today in America is something that is a complete opposite. Although it claims to be anti-racist, it's actually something that's a complete perversion of what they were doing in the 60s. But he was facing the same kind of reality in the communities in the southern North America. And people thought it was impossible to get rid of white racism and the stamped foot of the white man. But in reality, he says, we've got to build a community of hope. And he called it the beloved community. And this is the same kind of thing that I'm talking about when I talk about this idea of a high-performing network. So both pastors, I'm pushing us to take responsibility to get our pastors to move from institutional protectors to opening up territory and at least providing a framework in their churches to openly talk about these issues and build a community of hope. But the second thing, as I have suggested in point number 4 of my 5-part strategies, we need a high-performing network of people who are essentially in a position financially so that they don't have to be wiped out and destroyed when they get zingers. So I want to give you an example of this from over 200 years ago. Many of you know about the story of William Wilberforce, who becomes a Christian in 1785. He's a member of the British Parliament. He's best friends with the very young Prime Minister of England, William Pitt. By 1787, God puts it on his heart that he needs to begin to lead a movement to end the British slave trade. So he begins to gather around himself other aristocrats. These were people who did not have to work for a living, Simon. They came from different spheres of society. They came together. They brought together a commitment to actually fight this. They spent 20 years in and out of Parliament. They used all kinds of campaigns, petitions with sometimes hundreds of thousands of names on them, and they eventually succeeded. So you've got to have a high-performing network that leads this effort.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think that this, for those who might be listening and others, I think that this begins with a kind of a personal kind of crisis for every individual at a personal level, is to sort of start with the beginning yourself and say to him, well, if I don't want to cave into the cynicism, and I don't think the cynicism is actually a option for a Christian. We're meant to be people of hope. One can understand why secularists would be like that, or non-believers would just cave into it because they have no hope. But unlike those of us who follow Christ, we're told we have hope. We have a lot more than just hope. We have everything, according to Paul. And so if it's going to begin, it's going to need to be initiated from within the individual hearts and minds of Christians to then begin to get serious about this, because it's very, very kind of, it becomes kind of like almost a comedy show here. When you hear people talking about we're against corruption here in South Africa, and everybody's just laughing,
Probably they rolled their eyes.
Everybody's just rolling down and say, "Oh, come on, please!" It's almost and of course that just cheapens everything, because then people just lose confidence in all the institutions, and there's potential catastrophe behind that. And what awoken me to the catastrophe was reading Alexander Solzhenitsyn's work on Russia. I mean, it was one thing being mindful of the effects of communism as a political ideology, but what struck me was the scale of corruption that was behind the whole fabric of Russian society, that really did great violence in smashing that country to pieces financially, was just the scale of corruption, behind the utopian ideals. And we saw that cashed out. So let me get to a question then. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned there making a start then. In terms of a curriculum, if you're going to raise up a group of people, you spoke about an anti-corruption curriculum. Have you guys actually put together an anti-corruption curriculum?
No.
Or do you know people who have?
At this point, I don't really know of anyone who's put together such a curriculum, but I foresee, I can tell you this, that based on efforts from the Faith and Public Integrity Network and some other things that I know that are going on, that in the next few years, we're going to begin to see the launch of such a curriculum. Maybe someone there in South Africa who's an educator would like to become part of an international effort to do something. If so, I'd love to be in contact with them.
Well, if anybody's on listening to this, and this is kind of an area of your interest and concern, maybe you're an economist, a Christian economist, lawmaker, whatever, political science student, then maybe you can contact Dr. Osborne through the Wilberforce Institute. But perhaps we could have some students, who knows, maybe over there coming to do some work with you guys to kind of be this group, as you said, a group of people to lead in this area, and if it can come from the church, all the better, because once you're in the domain of politics, it's even, I think it's the difficulty to operate there is it's so bogged down in this and so tied up, it becomes even more difficult to move around once you're in the political arena, although we need people at every level on that. All right, let me just see if I've got any yeah, we have a few questions rolling in here now from our audience now. This is a question, the first question, yes, is why is the presence of Protestant Christianity specifically that is a seemingly necessary factor in low corruption numbers? So that statistic that you gave us there, 8 out of 10, I believe it was. What would be the logical connections there?
Yeah, what are the logical? That's a very, very good question. And I actually have another slide set where I talk about this issue. But basically, to summarize, number one, the Protestant communities have, starting with Martin Luther, strongly emphasized grace. And I pointed out that you have to really move from a transactional view of reality, which is fundamentally rooted in shamanism and that sort of thing. But it's also part of standard religion, if I could call it, outside of Christian faith. Catholics, to some degree, began to get near it, but there's too much transactionalism in a lot of Roman Catholicism. It's a mixed bag. In America, they're more grace-oriented, but many parts of the world, they're very transactional. Transactionalism is fundamentally the problem. So what Christianity, Protestant Christianity teaches is that Christ gives himself to us as a sacrifice on our behalf. So we don't do anything to enable his gift to come to us. He offers the gift freely. So that way of understanding reality suggests that if God has loved us that way, then the way we are to love our neighbors, Matthew chapter 22, is that we are to love our neighbors with the same kind of freely given willingness to seek their welfare. And once you begin to do that, people begin to develop trust in you when they realize you're seeking their welfare. The second thing is that Protestant Christianity is highly moralistic to one degree or another. When I say moralistic, what I'm trying to say is that it especially when you go back to, for example, the Puritans, who had tremendous influence in the founding of USA, the emphasis on having a holy and moral life, following and obeying God's 10 Commandments, not as a rigid law to seek and please God, that's transactionalism again, but as a loving response to the gift that Christ has given us. So I think that's a second factor. And then thirdly, Protestant Christianity laid the basis for a kind of public engagement that was not possible prior to that. So the sort of hierarchical nature of the Roman Catholic Church, while there were some things about that were effective, and I don't put it down in that sense, but what it didn't do well at all was to create a sense of popular responsibility for the future of the society. So you have Martin Luther talking about the priesthood of the believer. And so that priesthood, that concept, enables people to develop a sense of responsibility. They come together as a community to hire their pastors, to select their town leaders. And when people do that, they have political ownership. And when people have political ownership, then they have an incentive, and they have also through representative government, a method, at least in theory, by which they can vote out of office those who are corrupt and vote in office those who are people who are honest and transparent. Over time, then, with several hundred years of this kind of developing a culture of integrity, by the 1800s or the 19th century, you began to see this development of pretty sophisticated institutions. Many of them are state institutions, but they're institutions that began to reinforce integrity and make it harder for people. And once that you have this, what we call the virtuous cycle is in place, then it's hard for people to leave that virtuous cycle. The reward is you get rewarded for virtue in your free market transactions. Ideally, you get rewarded for it instead of penalized for it. Whereas in much of the world, it's the opposite. You get penalized for free market transactions because you can make more money through corruption.
That's interesting. So what about the skeptic who would say to you, well, look, you're singing the praises of the Protestant tradition, the Puritans, and so forth and so on. And here in Africa, the church is growing. Why aren't we seeing the same benefits here in Africa from much of the work? If I was going to play devil's advocate, how would you respond to that accusation?
I believe that is one of the most important questions that world Christianity needs to ask and answer right now. And I've been asking it for several years. The answers that I've developed, at least, and I look forward to, I would love to have another scholar or two who'd like to take this on as an international project, because we really need to work on this issue. This is a big one. My answer at this point is that the Christianity that has, especially in Africa, that you see, that has swept through Africa in the last 50 years in an enormous way, is about, as we say in America, an inch, you might say a centimeter, but an inch deep and a mile wide, which means it's very much at the surface. It has not transformed the worldviews, the thinking of people on the continent. So I am deeply concerned that we're rewarding evangelists at the expense of the Christian educators. The reward in much of the world, even here in America, is if you have big numbers of people that you bring to Christ, that's where the reward is, so to speak.
Yes.
You're going to have people supporting you. But it's the Christian educators who are the ones leading the effort, in many cases, to disciple people. And we are not doing that in most parts of Africa, to be honest with you. It's the exception rather than the norm. So right there, I think
I would concur with you. I would think that, and a kind of a quick response on my side, I think to some extent the issue there is that theology is kind of me focused in terms of, you and what's going to happen in your life. And of course, in an African culture, much of African traditional religions is trying to the individual concerned with their daily lives, whether it's health or wealth or whatever. And so if the theology lends itself to it, then they just run with that. You don't have to really do much violence to the person's own internal, a bit of introspection there. But I think a theology which makes more of a demand to become Christ-like then and discipleship along that lines, which is a much tougher task, because that is to really begin to confront people at a much more fundamental level, and to see that in the Christian life, really, it's not really about you or your present comforts. So that I think is perhaps a large factor in why we're you can see in Africa, and I've heard this, and it's probably it's not going to be light when I say this, but in many places, you see this criticism of Africa. It's kind of almost like a racist slur, because you say, well, look at what Christianity's done to South Korea. Look at what Christianity did in Europe. What's wrong with Africa? And I would go, well, hang on a sec. You, number one, you're assuming that the theology, which was the change in Protestant, is the same thing that's here now. And that's why I think the error is there. That's an important distinction which I think needs to be made there, is that I think a lot of African people have been subjected to very shallow theology, sadly, a theology that's divorced or devoid of this deeper stuff, the deeper ethical demands of a Christ-like life. Anyway, that would be worthy of another conversation. Yeah. Another question here: how are Christians and churches meant to overcome modern rejection of religious principles in anti-corruption campaigns, as well as postmodern suspicion of truth claims?
This is that's a big one. I think until our churches really wrestle with the issues of integrity and transparency from within, there are going to be a lot of eyes rolled if we go into the public sector and try to make a case for anti-corruption in the public sector. So in some sense, we have to clean up our own house in terms of corruption. But beyond that, and where the house may have been cleaned up, so to speak, we're going to have to face down postmodernism, and I think we're going to have to draw people in part. We're going to have to help them to understand that the very deepest assumptions of postmodernism are incoherent. They do not correspond to reality, and they're impossible upon which to build your life. My son is a civil engineer, and he told me years ago, Dad, if I was a postmodern civil engineer, there's not a single one of my structures that would stand without collapsing. In other words, reality sort of forces you to face what's really going on. So I think part of the challenge, and others may have other thoughts here, but I think part of the challenge with postmodernism, we have to challenge it at its weakest points. It is highly inconsistent. It cannot give you a true basis for finding justice. It cannot appeal to me for example, as a white man, to offer justice to anybody from any other identity group, which it claims to do, by the way, because it says each group has their own morality. So why should I become under the aegis of some other group's morality? And then finally, I would like to attack the postmodern emphasis on power. I do acknowledge that power is a reality, but I want to tell you that there are only two ways to get someone off a hill that they claim to own. Back when I was a boy in America, we had a game called King of the Hill. Maybe you have something like that in South Africa. There are only two ways you get this stupid boy off that hill. First of all, you try to reason with him. You use reason, and you hope that reason will make sense. You don't have any supporters. You're not that big a guy. If all of us rush the hill together, we could take you down. You try to reason with him and hope that he'll come down off the hill and see the reason. But if he refuses to listen to reason, then what have you got left? Well, what the postmodernists have said, let's just throw reason out the window. Let's go rush the hill right now and drag him down. But the reality is, once you have abandoned reason as your basis for achieving a worthy goal in public life, then you have committed yourself to brutality and terror and violence as a way to achieve good ends. You will undermine your ends by your commitment to using the ethic of power. Yeah.
I think that is certainly true of some of the cultures who have used power in that way. These societies end up eating themselves up from within. I recently watched a documentary on the French Revolution. It was interesting to me how the movement began for good reasons, and then by the time it ended, the Jacobins were all busy guillotining each other, and it's very interesting to see that what happens in the French Revolution. I'm thinking this started well, it didn't end so well, and then what replaces that? Well, then you get Napoleon. I'm like, there's maybe a few lessons that should be learned here in that little experiment there in France a few hundred years ago. Anyway, some more questions here. This is a matter of dispute amongst Christians. Should Christians take office in government, or should there be a radical separation between the affairs of the church and the state? I mean, if the governments are so corrupt, and as you've shown there, that it's often at the government level because of the way it's structured, it's particularly prone to this.
Yeah.
Because you kind of got the fox taking care of the hen house, and the foxes are appointing their other foxes into positions, and shouldn't we just stay out of it? What would your advice be? I mean, should Christians be involved in politics?
I don't agree with that idea of leaving public space. So I do definitely think that we need to recognize that the church and the state are two very separate institutions, but I do not agree with the idea that the churches or the Christian influence should not be felt in public life, in the state. So we've got to have Christians engaged in the state. It's dirty. You'll get muddy at times. That's why you need to have a support group of other believers who will help you to wash off the mud after you've been in the state. That's just part of the process. But if we don't get in there, if we don't engage with it, it just gets darker and darker. It gets more violent. It gets more brutal. Christians are a redemptive presence wherever we enter, or at least we should be. And to that degree, we help to make any environment better than it would otherwise be.
Okay, very good. A question here. Do you think that natural law theory could be an essential tool for Christians to help address corruption in the state?
Yes, I do think natural law theory can be useful. Natural law theory often appeals to the teaching, for example, of Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle, or in a more broad sense to what we can learn from science and from just observing how reality works. So yes, I think we ought to use it, and I think it ought to be used as a supplement, a complement to biblical law. And this is essentially when I was showing you the map of levels of corruption around the world.
Yes.
Were developed by Transparency International. Essentially, that's, in one sense, I'm appealing to natural law. And I'm saying, look, here's what we learn from physical reality. And as we observe physical reality and social reality, but social reality is what I mean to say, as we observe social reality, we can notice patterns, and the patterns are clear. There's a correlation between corruption and your historic Protestant nature.
Okay. Another interesting request here. There's a request for you to just go back to the quotation on the difference between the gift and the bribe. They wanted you just to look at that quote again from the Bible.
Sure. Let's go back there, and I'll share my screen.
You can share it again, and maybe unpack it for us again. That'll be good.
Yeah, I would love to do that. So let me, let's see where I'm at here. Okay, let's go back there because we'll look at that. We didn't actually spend much time in this. So this is a Roman Catholic professor of law. A bribe expresses self-interest. A gift conveys love. You could stop right there and it says everything. But I think the rest of it's powerful. A bribe subordinates the recipient to the donor. A gift identifies the donor with the recipient. Think of how Christ identified himself with us by becoming a human being. The book of Hebrews chapter 4 captures that nicely. A gift brings no shame. A bribe must be in secret. By the way, in my research on corruption, this is a huge issue. Nobody really wants to talk openly about when they give a bribe or when they demand a bribe. A gift may be disclosed. A bribe must be concealed. The size of a gift is irrelevant. The size of a bribe, decisive. And people who have had to deal with government officials or with some business people know how important this is. A gift does not oblige, A bribe coerces. So one of the things that, if I could just say one more thing about that, Simon, I have noticed in your part of the world, a lot of the people live in communities where if you're successful, you're expected to share your wealth with everybody else in the community. In fact, you're socially obligated. You are effectively coerced to do so. This is called demand sharing. Again, I think this is a function and part of the sort of the transactional nature of the shamanistic approach to reality. But Christianity changes it dramatically, and I argue that the Christian understanding of, and the biblical understanding of generosity is that it's always voluntary. It's not coerced, it's voluntary.
Yes.
Because everything is understood in the framework of gift. It doesn't mean that we don't have commercial transactions. I'm not opposed to that, and I can give you a rationale for all of that. But I'm saying that in terms of non-commercial interaction, it should be built around the concept of gift rather than anything else.
Yes. No, very good. And then, because I know we're over the hour now, so I'll close out with one final issue with that, because I know we want to respect your time. There, we usually go an hour, just over an hour.
Sure.
But I'm very interested in, as we're living in kind of a, well, certainly Africa. Wouldn't be right to say West, as we're in Africa, but obviously a place particularly influenced by the West in terms of political ideas, constitutions, democracy, law, that kind of thing. But as we look to the West now, Europe and America and around those parts of the world influenced by those ideas and concepts, it's interesting to me how we're seeing various institutions changing, have been changed. The university, we see this tension between the science, technology, engineering departments,
right.
and the realist philosophy and the social sciences with their postmodernist philosophy, and it's going to be to see how in years to come we see this in whether these two silos are going to actually even talk to each other, because it seems impossible. It's a great point for Christians to point this out in the universities.
That's right.
Is the fact that the philosophy over the social science is incompatible with the philosophy over the hard sciences, and demand an explanation. But you see that in the academy. You see corporations who are no longer advertising according to the quality of their products. But, the recent Nike advert, for example, it's not about sports apparel. It's about whether you're with us or for us. And if you're not with us, then you're against us. And I don't know what that has to do with shoes, but that's Nike's new ad campaign. If you can't beat it, change it. If, there's somebody out to get us. And anyway, I've noticed this in the corporate world. You see all of these institutions being undermined. And of course, one of those institutions, you see the church. You see the church in Europe pretty much has been decimated, and pretty much as Europe is for the most part secular. The Christian heritage there is a hangover. As Jürgen Habermas says, what's left of Christianity is this ethic to some extent, but in terms of commitments to Christ, few to be found. Then there's this thing that's happening now, which is and America. When I was in America, they had the constitutional ruling on marriage, 5-4 ruling on marriage, changing of traditional views of marriage.
Right.
But it seems to me, though, that the final institution, this little thing called the family, is where the attack has finally arrived now. Having the media now, having the universities, having the corporate world, having everything running in this direction, the final thing to smash is the family. Absolutely. And you see that now with the redefinition of what family is, marriage, and even sexuality for that matter.
Right.
Totally. Anatomy and physiology don't matter anymore. Sex
Right.
is a social construct. But this relationship between the family has been the kind of final institution that you've got to atomize, to smash up. The ethical implications of that, because of course, I'm a dad, I've got 5 kids, try and teach my kids to speak the truth, not to steal. I'm teaching them all these things in my house here.
Right. That's right.
As somebody who's focused on corruption, what do you think of this kind of, it's not even pretended now, it's pretty much an explicit attack on the traditional views of family and ethics.
Yeah.
I just want to see what you thought of that as it relates to global corruption.
Certainly. So philosophers like Aquinas long ago recognized that the family is he called it the seedbed of society.
Okay.
So that's the key concept, seedbed of society. So the understanding was that the family is where you develop the kinds of not only skills needed for public engagement and to work as leaders in society, but the moral framework is all built there. Your sensibilities, everything is formed within the family. Schools and other institutions supplement it. But we see repeatedly here in America, when people are coming from broken homes, it's very difficult for educators to overcome the brokenness, the moral brokenness, the disorganization, the inability to restrain your impulses. All of those things are falling apart. So you're exactly right. The postmodernists are finally, and I'm going after the postmodernists on this, because everything you're talking about right now is being driven almost entirely by postmodern and critical theorists like Habermas and his colleagues, destroying. That's the last institution that they are determined to destroy, and then the state will become massively powerful, because there'll be nothing between you as an individual and the state. So the state becomes larger, the family's destroyed, the individual becomes a peon who's dragged along under the imperial majesty of the state. None of this ends well. All of it ends badly. So Christians, that's why people make fun of Christians and their obsession with the family and marriage and sex. But that obsession, as they say, is built in reality. That's how reality works. This is how you build a good society, is you build strong families where kids learn in the seedbed of society how to function in the broader society.
Yeah, well, I can tell you, if you're going to, if there was a section of the curriculum, I would love to see something written explicitly on that, because I know other people get annoyed because we're always trying to talk about relationships and marriage. But as I'm getting older and older, and I'm beginning to reflect upon where society is, I'm beginning to see that this thing called that little family, the husband and wife and his kids and his little empire, his little kingdom, his little house, wherever it may be, that father, that mother loving each other.
That's right.
Loving those children and being in
Absolutely.
relationship. That thing is so important, because if you don't have it, it's almost impossible to begin, And even within our corrupt churches, which, as you correctly have pointed out, some of those churches are corrupt. It's going to have to literally start within the hearts of certain Christian families. Are going to have to say no, and find a few other families who say no. In that kind of that thing which is now mocked and spat upon and laughed at and ridiculed, that silly little thing called the Christian family, is where it all begins, is in my estimation. And so I encourage all Christians, go to more events about the family. Go to more sessions to learn how to be a good dad and a good mom. Go to more events that teach you how to raise a good family, because in some sense, being a traditional Christian parent, is going to be a radical thing nowadays, because society's attempt is to destroy that thing and to tear it down. And it's interesting to see all the arguments that are leveled against the nuclear family. It's fascinating to see the critique of it. And it's fascinating historically to see those guys, I think, going back to, you see this in the writings of philosophers like Rousseau.
Yes, certainly with him.
Yeah, and then through Karl Marx as well,
Right.
interestingly. And then you can go back even to the Greeks, this notion of the state. You take the kids off the parents, and the state's in charge. But this radical little thing called the Christian family, I think, is a very important thing. So it'd be good to see you guys also have that as a part of the curriculum in this team.
Thank you for reminding us of that and bringing that issue out. That's extremely important, and we've got to have that as part of it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I would like to see that as well, and I'm pretty sure there's some academics who can really put some weight behind that as well. It's just been a thought of mine as I've been
fine academics. Yeah,
how we live here in South Africa, where there's so much. It's very difficult to motivate people to start. But my wife and I are realizing that we can begin by just saying, people, just live a godly life, live a godly Christian family life. That's a start. That'll shine a light out into this world. That's where you can start there, and then ask for God to give us favor as we hope He will build upon at least faithfulness in that regard. So yeah, that's where we can begin. All right, Dr. Osburn. Well, look, thank you so much for your time.
Great privilege. I've been loving it, Simon.
Yes, and I encourage all of you who've been listening this evening, if you can keep in touch. Dr. Osborne's a great guy to keep in touch with. You can check out his book online. I think you can go the book that he wrote on confronting the.
It's called Taming the Beast.
Taming the Beast. Yes, it's got a Taming that Beast. The beast, this thing called corruption. He's also with the Wilberforce Academy as well, so you can check that out. We're going to put those links down below. And hopefully you'll be able to come and visit us again here in South Africa.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, maybe we can connect with folks, and maybe we can work with some of the other Christians in South Africa who are making an effort, and I'll touch base with them. And maybe we can be part of a group that begins something here in our own country. We need it. And so maybe we'll pray that God would use you, and feel free to share your resources with us, and help us with this, because this is a big issue here. And a lot of people have given up or just throw their hands in the air, or worse, it's become a joke now. It's like it's comedy in South Africa. It's pathetic. It's very sad, unfortunately. But hopefully, as Christians, won't become hopeless like that.
And there are people around the world who are engaging with it. We have mentees all around the world. Several are here from Southeast Asia, and they're very concerned in tackling these issues. So thank you so much.
And I want that to be of encouragement to South Africans. I had the privilege of working in the Philippines for a number of months, and what struck me is the similarity in the issues and people's with corruption. I came across it there when I was in the Philippines, and I thought, I guess this is a problem all over the world. We're not the only country in the world that has these problems. There's a lot of countries that have these problems. Yeah. All right then. Well, good night, Dr. Osborn. Have a good rest of your afternoon, and we'll be in touch. And as hopefully COVID comes to end, maybe you can come visit us in South Africa in the near future.
I look forward to that. And good day to my good friends Colin and Waihan. Bye-bye.
Take it. All right then. Bye-bye.